Hollyfield. I'm the managing editor of the Dallas Morning News. And with me, I have Scott Reese Willie, executive editor of the award-winning Fort Bend Herald newspaper, just recently award-winning. Very wonderful. He started his career 33 years ago at the Victoria Advocate during his senior year at the University of Houston. I love that. Lexi Churchill is a research reporter with the award-winning ProPublica Texas Tribune Investigative Unit. She was previously a Scripps Howard Research Fellow at ProPublica, where she published an investigation exposing how the Trump administration's quick and quiet crackdown on Idaho's Medicaid procedures created new red tape that kept children with special needs and the state's poorest residents from maintaining insurance. Important reporting. And Tony Poletsky, did I say that right? Yep. Yes, is an investigative reporter for the Austin American-Statesman and KVUE, Austin's ABC affiliate, and has worked as a journalist in the Texas Capitol for nearly 25 years. His reporting has led to criminal indictments, changes in state law, and other government reform. He was the lead reporter in the Statesman's reporting after the Uvalde school shooting in 2022 that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize Gold Medal for Public Service. We'll definitely be talking about that today. So I just want to start with, each of you, what's for you, what's the state of getting public records right now? Is it great? Is it sort of good? Is it worse than it's ever been? Tony, I'll start with you.
I think it's jurisdiction by jurisdiction. There are certainly places that are used to us knocking on the door with public information requests, and those places are pretty skilled and pretty efficient. They know the law and they're responsive. There are others, however, who rarely interface with journalists, who are not subject very often to journalistic request or journalistic inquiry, particularly rural counties that we may interact with across the state. And when we encounter that kind of resistance or that kind of lack of education about the law and what's required to be released under the law, frankly, it can be extraordinarily difficult. And that's where we really do run up against effective in many ways open records laws in our state, but in other ways, it can become very apparent that we as a state still need to do more to open up government access to records and information.
Lexi?
I would agree with that. I think on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, it really depends on the jurisdiction, what you're requesting, all of those sorts of things. I recently, in the last few months, had a request for a FOIA log to a state agency appealed to the Attorney General's office, and they ruled they could withhold it, which is pretty crazy, considering that's about the most basic record you could request from any agency. And yet in the last few weeks, I've also had a few requests fulfilled for records I really did not think I would get and fulfilled the next day or within a few days. So totally random examples from day to day. But I think as a whole, from a big picture standpoint, as I was reflecting ahead of the panel, I did think, I haven't been covering Texas as long as my colleagues up here, but in the 4 years that I've been covering Texas, there's been at least one huge catastrophic event that usually involves some level of state accountability or state failure that happens every year, at least one, I think. In 2020, that was COVID. 2021, after the winter storm, of course. 2022, Uvalde, we'll get into it. And in 2023, obviously, a lot of records around the Attorney General and, requests that came in even before that year. And it's in those moments of real catastrophic kind of concern about what the state is doing, how we got here, and trying to understand that we need the transparency on that level the most, that we tend to get it the least, is my thinking on this. In 2020, obviously, a lot of agencies took advantage of the disaster relief that allowed them to prolong records requests for months at a time. Some were taking advantage of that well into 2021, sometimes 2022, which was crazy. After the winter storm, of course, we were all wondering, how did we get here? What records can show why we got here? And instead of releasing them, the Attorney General said, actually, ERCOT and PUC, the agencies that have these records, are fully exempt from FOIA, and they don't have to release anything at all. And then Uvalde, of course, we'll talk about extensively, I'm sure, soon. Scott?
Well, I can say that I filed FOIA requests electronically. They went unanswered. And so I sent it hard copy through the mail with a return request receipt. They refused to pick it up at the post office, right? Because I have a tracker, I can see it when it arrived. They refused to do it. So then I drove there, hand delivered, and they refused to stamp it. Well, there's a time stamp so you can show that when they actually got it. So I filed open records request. I complained to the Attorney General's office. Finally, there's an attorney who made it all happen. So, it's a battle.
You don't want to name drop?
And there was a sheriff's department. I filed records with them, requests with them, and their responses were bare minimum that they could get by with, which never answered any of my questions. So y'all might have more power than I do, but they don't. But eventually, a city attorney looked at it and just told them, "Look, this is public information. We got to give it to them." And so they gave me 3 years worth of records. I asked for 10. Then I had to file another complaint with the Attorney General's office saying, "Hey, this is disingenuous. They should have 10 years of records easily on this." The banks require 7 years minimum. The Attorney General office sent them a demand letter saying, "Hey, man, you got to respond to them." Then they let me come back and see their records, and their records are missing and gaps in it. And
That's why they didn't want you to have them.
it could be. It could be.
A mess.
What, each of you, what's the best public records reporting you've done this year? And what were the big obstacles to getting there? Scott, we'll start with you. Is that the story you're talking about? And what was the story?
I filed. I had 3 city council people came in and said, "Listen, Mr. Willie, we haven't seen the financial reports and records in months, if not years." I said, "What are you talking about?" They go, "Like credit card statements, bank account statements. We don't get to see them." I said, "Well, you're a city council. What are you talking about?" And they said, "The mayor won't let us see them." I said, "Well, I'll file an open records request and see if I can see them." And so I did. On the very next day, I started filing and nothing happened. It took me about a month to finally get the records. I think it was about a month, maybe a month and a week or two to finally come in. And so I said, well, let's see. Maybe there's a reason they didn't want anyone to see these records. And I started going through them, and there was, 3 years worth. So I just read them. Yeah, they're eating out. They're doing this. It didn't seem like much. And then I saw a specific purchase. I said, wait a second. And I flipped back through all these months, and they'd eaten at the same place. And then I flipped back, and I realized there was a trend. So then I said, I need to put this in some sort of order so you can grasp it. So I typed out line by line every time they used credit cards by the date, so you could see how many times. Sometimes they ate 3 times a day. Sometimes one was eaten on this credit card, and other ones were eaten on this credit card. They were shopping. They were just. And once you put it in order, and I thought, you know what? People need to see this list. They need to see this list to see what I'm seeing, and they can draw their own conclusions. So we printed the lists, and they were extensive, and it took me weeks to type them up and to add them up to make sure they all added up. And then I had a secretary add it up, and it didn't work out. So I re-added it. It didn't work out a second time. She added it. It took us about a month to make sure the numbers were good, right? 3 times they had to. We agreed they would come out 3 times, the same numbers on each of ours, and then we would do it. And finally, got that in the paper. Now, it was like 400 inches story, and my newspaper has a rule of a 10-inch story. So what I did was I waited till my bosses left for the weekend. And on Friday, I put the story in the paper. I went home. I boxed up everything because I knew I was going to be moving. And come Monday morning, my president was going, well, it read good. So,
Congratulations.
but it had its intended results. Everybody read it. I was swamped with phone calls and emails and text messages, and I was amazed at the number of mayors in our county who called me and said, "Hey, let me tell you about this guy. Let me tell you what he's done. Let me tell you," right? And so it was just stunning. Business people calling me saying, you can't accept their checks. They bounce. Everything bounces, And so It really had, people saw those lists and they were outraged. They were so angry. And even to this day, they were going, when will charges be filed? And I said, well, I don't know that a crime was committed, although the district attorney said they were looking into it. So, but it had, you know, those lists, they were eye-opening. Everything. They were eating out all the time. I mean, these are legitimate business expenses. We were taking out people who were doing business with the city. Yeah, $99 at Dairy Queen. You're right. So that was what, 6 meals? That's
hard to spend $99.
yeah, $80
whole-
at Subway. Just on Sundays, they were treating business people out on Sundays, holidays, weekends. They were buying so much. The cities only got 320 people. It's only literally 1 square mile. So you can stand at the entrance and you can see and you know what? They were spending thousands and thousands of dollars on gasoline, right? Even though they had a contract with the county to get cheap gas at the county depot. And then so we requested those reports. And sure enough, you can see all this long list of all the gas expenses they got for their 1 mile of mowing, I guess. And yet, at the same time they were buying this gas, they were buying gas at gas stations, just $100 and $200 for the gas at a time. So, you know, that was pretty eye-opening. Shopping online, shopping for groceries, going to grocery stores, spending $400. Now, I'm sure that was a legitimate business expense for something. I don't know. I know they have an annual Juneteenth festival, and it's really nice, and they cook food and everything. And I counted heads because that's what we do. We count heads when we go places. And I counted about 54 people, and they spent like $10,000 on brisket. So I'm just thinking, maybe, I don't know.
Wow.
They spent a lot of money. I don't know. I say 10, I don't know. It was a lot of money on brisket. And I went to the local butcher shop and asked them, hey, how much brisket do people eat? And he said, well, you can give them like a half a pound per person. So I was looking at that going, holy smokes. But there was a lot of money spent.
Wow.
These were the council members?
No. Yeah. The council people are the ones that complained. They came and said, we didn't get to see these. And so I invited the council members, I invited the bookkeeper to my office and said, come look at this. And they went through the reports, you know, reading through them. Oh my gosh. And I asked them, is this legit? Can you guys, do they have permission? The mayor and the city secretaries have permission to do this? And no, they don't have permission to spend that money. They get paychecks. You know, I said, well, maybe they're feeding the staff. They do have a staff there. They have a staff as the mayor, a city secretary, and 2 maintenance people, because, you know, it's only 1 square mile. So these 2 guys, right, that's it. So on staff of 4, apparently they're feeding them every meal or taking them out to dinners on weekends. And
I just thought my story was interesting. It contains neither brisket nor Dairy Queen.
No more examples needed.
Kendleton, a little town called Kendleton, Texas. And let me tell you about Kendleton. You already know about Kendleton. It used to be a speed trap. And the police officers there would pull you over and then write you a ticket and then keep the money for themselves. And they went to prison for it. They went to prison for this, right? Right. So it was, oof. So I knew when I went over there, I said, I'm in a lot of trouble here.
Lexi, what's your best public records?
Wow, I don't know how you follow that. I would say my best public record story of the year is yet to come, so be on the lookout
All
the next
right.
few weeks. But I'll mention one from a few years ago. Actually, as one of our records requests after Uvalde, trying to understand the communications between DPS and some of the other state agencies, we filed a relatively broad request for some communications, and the very few records that they did release had nothing to do with Uvalde, but we were miraculously able to break the news that the DOJ was investigating DPS for Operation Lone Star from the records that they did actually release, which we were not expecting. So that was a fun one.
Tony.
So we're in the middle of some reporting, some ongoing reporting dealing with some open records, but it has to do with the security for one particular elected official here in Travis County. And the reporting that we've done is based on records, but also human sources as well. But essentially, we began pursuing a tip several months ago that Travis County commissioners had secretly routed $115,000 to the district attorney's office for the district attorney to harden his home amid threats allegedly that he received. And so what's interesting about that is that it's not only a public record story, it's also an open meetings story as well, because we were able to analyze the agenda item and have open records experts, including Bill Elshire, who is in the room, help us understand that the agenda item itself, where this occurred, was potentially legally insufficient and did not. Illegal. Illegal agenda item where this money flowed from county reserves to the district attorney's office. And then with regard to the open records part of it, there's an ongoing fight now because the county has refused to release even basic records about the expenditure of the money. What's interesting, though, is that just sort of not only the politics of records and the release of records, but also how things can be different. The sheriff of Travis County, I believe, to her great credit, did choose to release some information to us that indicated, subsequent to our initial story, that county constables had been sitting outside the district attorney's house for 7 months now, every night. And the sheriff's office also was able to provide information about the total number of threats that all county officials receive and the nature of those threats. And we were able to then put in context the information, the concerning communication that the district attorney received to really highlight a lack of standardization in the county about how threats are evaluated and then who gets security at their home. But what was really striking, just in terms of that body of work, was the county taking steps to harden an official's home, which we found as highly unusual for any elected official, federally, state, or local.
Was he the only one who his house had gotten hardened?
Yes.
And did he make, was there any kind of a public request by his office or anything?
The request was made in executive session, and without any public discussion, the county commissioners voted to move money, but there was no discussion in public about the movement of the money or what it was earmarked for, how it was going to be spent.
I guess they argued that the security, the privacy was because of security.
And that's one thing, frankly, that we're up against, and sort of this security discussion and sort of how government, when they want to hide something, can really apply this very broad security exception to not release information. So it's a difficult battle to navigate.
It's a great transition to Uvalde, which, I mean, let's just talk about that. I feel like most of that story wouldn't have been told without the journalism that went into that and the dogged journalism that went into that. And Tony, you should start. I mean, how many public records requests would you say you filed for that?
Well, I think between the two news outlets that I work for, the Statesman and KView, dozens, certainly, maybe 4 dozen, I would say, total among all of our colleagues. I mean, to the credit of both newsrooms, there was a kind of a unified effort, one person who was tasked with certainly keeping up with all of those records requests. But I do want to say, I mean, in my history here in Texas, that was the first time I had ever seen this coalition of news organizations really come together, and the strength of all of those news organizations coming together for one common goal. And I thought that was really, really striking and critically important.
So we heard earlier, we've gotten the city of Uvalde has released the records, right? And everything else is still tied up in litigation, right?
Right.
And so what are the key things that we don't have that you guys are still trying to get?
Well, I think that there's still information from the sheriff's office. There are other agencies. The school district has not yet released information to us. But also, I think that the fight for records and the release of certain records also illustrates, and I know I'm preaching to saying this to people who know this eminently, but records are one thing going through the front door and through open records request. I think what was so striking too about all the volume of reporting that has been done on Uvalde are sources who, for whatever reason, whatever their motivation, were willing and in some instances, I think, felt compelled to get public information to the public outside of the traditional open records process.
Lexi, what are your big takeaways about Uvalde and how that did work and how it should have worked?
Stuff. Nothing seemed to work the way it should. Yeah, I think, as Tony said, I think Uvalde is the best example of both government being able to use these laws to sweepingly withhold everything when they want to, but also when one person has an incentive for some of that information to be able to come out. But it's really important to understand what is that person's incentive, is what they're releasing to me the entire story, what context are we missing? Not that, it's not important to get that, but I think that's the part that makes it so difficult, because so many entities involved did not have that incentive, because so many, made mistakes. We still don't have any from DPS as well. Through the official public records, of course, and they had the most officers respond out of the Texas state agencies. And then, of course, there's the Customs and Border Protection, who just released a report yesterday acknowledging that their officers did not have enough training. But those are records we'd requested then as well that we weren't able to get over the last 2 years. And even the DOJ report did not include the CBP training records, which was a bit mind-blowing. So I don't know that anything really went correctly after Uvalde. I think we're lucky that there are some people that were incentivized to get some information out. Otherwise, I don't know what we would know at this point. We'd still know very little. We wouldn't have a visual in our minds of so many officers waiting outside of that room for so long, over an hour, 77 minutes. There's just so much we still wouldn't even know, which unfortunately is not unusual after a mass shooting. There's been a similar vacuum of information after El Paso, after Santa Fe, especially when there is a shooter who is still alive and possible prosecution. That's when we typically see it. So I think Uvalde was a little unusual in that case, because obviously there was not a shooter to prosecute after it happened. But we now know, obviously, the DA has chosen to prosecute 2 different officers. So that's the main reason why all of the records were withheld.
Let's talk about the video. And I think one of the things I think is interesting about public records is, sometimes you get a bunch of stuff and you have to make a decision about, I have it, but do I release this to the public? Because we have that responsibility, right? And anything we publish is out there for all time and changes things. And sometimes you have to weigh the value. And I'm just wondering if you could take us into that decision making process.
Sure. I mean, I can honestly say that it was the most wrenching decision that I've ever been a part of as a journalist and at the center of as a journalist. Certainly, we had to weigh, the traditional value of the public's right to know versus information that we have could inflict or cause more trauma to people. I'm happy to. I could talk all day, for the rest of the day about the intricacies of the decisions. But I think a friend of mine, a colleague, a mentor, said it best, which is that when we have information that is being sought by the public, our job and our responsibility is to, on the scale, move toward publishing and move toward airing. Certainly that does not mean everything we do we release to the public, but our job as journalists, the very definition of what we do is to provide information. And I think, waiting for days and having information where people were literally crying out for details, for an insight into what happened and what went wrong. Waiting for days just did not feel like what we should be doing as journalists.
Anything else you want to mention about Uvalde, Lexi?
No, I would agree. I think if you followed the Texas Tribune and ProPublica's reporting, we were able to obtain some records as well that have helped us with our further reporting on how difficult the medical response was because of how terrible the law enforcement response was and how those two things are intertwined. And then we did a really big story last year that took a deep dive into active shooter training. And we were able to obtain those records from the state because in the file we were able to find the names of officers, which, wasn't something that had been released publicly before. But we've grappled with the same questions. What should we release? What can we release? We ended up doing a documentary with Frontline that included a lot of the body cam information, a lot of the after action reports with officers, which is a type of record you rarely ever see, and gave a lot of insight into their thought process. And I think that was really demonstrative, to say the least. But we grapple with the same questions. And I think it's difficult to, at this point in the process, when Tony released that video, we didn't have anything at all at that point other than an acknowledgement that it had taken 77 minutes to respond. We had no visual of what that looked like. No other records had been released. By the time we've gotten these records, we're much further along down the road. And so it's a matter of what can we add that will actually be helpful to folks? Will dumping all this information actually help? There'll be very few people that, can actually take the time to go through hours and hours and hours and hours of this stuff. So I think as journalists, we have to think of, as you said, how can we tell this story and what records can we release that will actually help folks understanding without just putting it out there. So you mentioned that a few weeks ago, or maybe about a month ago now, through our joint lawsuit, the city of Uvalde was the first to actually release some records that we had sued them for through the Public Information Act. But even then, there was a record that was misinterpreted by several newsrooms, and there were a few facts that were incorrectly reported. And that's journalists that have been on this for multiple years. And so if someone that has that context can make that mistake, what will putting out these records without any context, what will that do in the general public? So these are some of the questions we wrestle with, as well as obviously the sensitivity of the information.
Sure. Do you want to add something, Tony?
No.
Scott, is there in your small newsroom, I'll start with, have you had a issue like this where you've had to grapple with we've got this information, but do we need to release it?
Yes. All joking aside, and my flair for dramatics, when I was discussing the story with my publisher, and he was flipping through the proof sheets, right? Going, oh my gosh, oh my God, we got to get this in the paper. He said, that's what he's talking about. Now we got to do this right. Do we want to name names? Do we want? And so we discussed it, and I said, you're the boss. You tell me what to do, but I think we should go with names. And so he read it. And he said, well, I'll let you know tomorrow. So then he went home. And I came back the next day, he goes, and he threw it on my desk, he goes, we need to name names, we need to have specifics, and we need to show details because details tell the story, right? I mean, like, you know, a police investigator, the details tell you everything you need to know. So,
Scott, how in your newsroom, how do you make time for? How do you prioritize? How do you organize? What's the strategy?
right. So, I'm doing the garden club story. The new daffodil photo is going to go on the front page. And so, how do you make time for that and the civic clubs and the church news? And we do community journalism. We do community journalism really well. If someone farts in town, we let people know what it smelled like. Right? We blanket coverage our area. And that's how we survive under the umbrella of the Houston Chronicle. We do feature story. I did a feature story on a guy whose best friend was a rooster. That's what we do. And so occasionally, sometimes you get a bigger story that falls in your lap. And I ended up working till midnight, maybe 3 months in a row, just trying to type up the list, rewriting it, passing on my knowledge to my publisher. Here's where we at right now. Here's what we're looking, giving timelines, reorganizing my my notes so that I know what other further questions need to be asked. Trying to get a hold of people who could give me comment. So, it's requires a lot of organization, and we're a newsroom of 3 people: me, a sports editor, and one writer who gives me a story a day and gives the sports guy a story a day. And so, there's not much time to do investigative journalism. But again, once I saw what I was looking at, I realized, you got to make time for it. And so we made time for it. And my publisher told me, make time for it. So you got to make some time. Because I said, oh, well.
Lexi, what's your strategy for
I love this
keeping on
question.
top of this?
Yeah. So I love FOIA. I think it's our superpower. I think it's an amazing thing that we should take advantage of all the time. So to help, obviously that's easier said than done. So to help kind of strategize and organize, I like to think of my records requests in 3 different buckets. One is phishing requests, maybe for communications between 2 agencies about a specific topic. You have some idea of what you may get back. It may be a story, it may not be, but you would just want to put it out there and see what you get back. 2 is reoccurring requests for records that you should be regularly asking for: FOIA logs, city officials' calendars, elected officials' calendars, visitors' logs, things like that. The Texas Tribune does an amazing job of this with the state salary database, which you can access. It's a database online. It has all of the state employees. They are regularly requesting that data and using it as a public service that way. And then there's the more targeted requests, which are typically within the story that you're working on or trying to pursue, where it's for, the police's training records to help build the database so we can understand what their prior active shooter training was, like for the Uvalde story, and different things like that. So those end up being the requests that I'm really on. Obviously, we want to get those back as quickly as possible. The reoccurring requests are periodic, and then the phishing requests can kind of work for you in the background. And it's a treat when you get them back. Little treat.
Like a Christmas present.
Little present. So that's how I sort of organize my thoughts around.
What about you, Tony? You have a special strategy or approach to how you do public records reporting?
I always try to similarly have like a batch of phishing expedition requests, something that I hope or think might yield something, but that you never really know. But the front line for me is always, I've gotten a tip for this record I need to ask for, or, here is some larger enterprise piece that I'm asking for. And I maintain a spreadsheet and keep on top of it. And one of the things that I also just try to have some fun with is, holding the feet to the fire of the agency too, who may not respond in a timely manner, and going after them in that way, or sending them an email telling them their past deadline, things like that.
That's right where I was going next. Do you feel like, I certainly feel from what I see in my newsroom that it's just become a default of just go straight to the AG, and like no answer, just go straight to the AG. And it just, I'm just wondering what you guys have seen in terms of that, in terms of whether it's, but it seems like it's set up so that it should be, you should get a response and it should all work, but it doesn't seem like much conversation is happening. There's just a default.
I think there can be a default unless the agency, for whatever reason, wants to release something, and you do occasionally get that. But yeah, I think going to the AG is almost sort of pro forma for a lot of agencies, and it's very, very frustrating, especially when we know, like a list of all the FOIAs you've received was something that's just very, very much transparent and an open record on its face. That's very, very frustrating.
Are you having the same situation, Liz?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's less of a conversation that happens normally between hey, we may not be able to release this. Can you narrow it in a way so we can actually release part of what you're looking for, to we're just going to appeal it to the AG. I don't want to, demonize public records officials, though, because some are out there to help you. Not everyone wants to do this, but they do have a big, to-do list, a big list that they're working through. So I think that's why it's really important to take the time to build those relationships when you can. So you're not just another thing on their to-do list. You're actually a face that maybe they want to be helpful. They know you. That can come in handy sometimes. So I do think that's where it really becomes important.
Scott, how about you?
Like I said earlier, I was very fortunate that there was a city attorney who just would look at my request and goes, "This is clearly public information. Give him the information." And so, wow, that usually goes to the AG, and it was, all of a sudden he said, "Yeah, just come get it right now. Yeah, just come on over. Everything I want. Yeah, just come on over."
Wow.
So there are some attorneys out there who understand this. They abide by it. They even promote it. He seemed to promote openness and transparency and say, "Yeah, come on, I'm gonna give you everything you want." And then when I didn't get everything because there were gaps, he would go back and talk to him and say, "Listen, you got to give it to him. I know you don't want to, but you got to do it." And they fired him. So
Oh,
Exactly.
no.
technically, he quit because they were gonna fire him. So,
Oh,
anyway, but he was wonderful. Man, this guy, man, he knew it's public information. That's a police report. It's gonna be public information. All right.
So we heard this morning about some legislation that this group is going to push forward to help improve public records laws. And I'm wondering if you guys, if you had the power to change the law as set up now, what would you want tweaked? What would you want fixed?
The ongoing investigation exemption is just a pain in the behind on a regular basis, and we saw it frankly with Uvalde. It was one of the exemptions that DPS used to not release information. So I think if there could be some sort of tightening of that, to really make it clear, like what kind of investigation, what kind of possible charges are anticipated, just something that would not give
That would narrow it.
would narrow it and not give such a broad exemption to law enforcement, I think could be especially helpful.
yeah. I think that's a big one. I think another one we're dealing with a lot now is, I think the whole 10-day timeline is a huge misnomer. Like, oftentimes you are not actually going to get your records back or even a response back a lot of the times in 10 days. I think that's a huge misunderstanding. We encounter a lot of agencies that are like, we need, another 10 days, another 2 weeks. And we have no recourse for that. I mean, they can keep pushing it, whether it's to just give you an initial response of whether or not they're going to give you the records or the release of records itself. There's one agency in particular that's really giving us a hard time with this right now. And we even sent them the check for some data. They said it would take 10 to 20 staff hours. This was back in July. And they said, "Okay, thanks. We got the check. We'll give you the data in November." Like, what? You said it would take 10 hours. And there's nothing we can do about it really besides send some strongly worded emails. So I think this notion of, the 10-day window is not one that is like totally understood. And agencies really have the power to prolong the process as long as they want, really.
Okay, so the very same mayor that abused taxpayer generosity. He's been criminally charged on 3 counts. 2 counts of failure to provide public information as required under state law. He withheld public information. And he was charged with official oppression, using his office to, do the stuff. So anyway, he goes to trial next month, October. So a change, we need punishment. There's got to be punishment. There's no teeth. If you're not going to be punished, we've got to send a message to these guys. Look, you follow state law. It's a state law. I know you don't like it, but that's a state law. The people wanted it. It's law. You got to follow it. And if not, you're going to be punished. So, is he going to be punished next month? I hope so, because that will send a message to everybody else who wants to withhold public information. But we have to have some teeth, and we don't have teeth right now. They just
The charge against the mayor was it the DA or
the DA. So the mayor he refused to respond to open records requests. So a complaint went to the attorney general, who sent them a note. I sent them a demand letter saying, "Listen, you got to respond to these things. And by the way, also send it to us so we can review it." You have a choice. You can give them the information. You can request a ruling on our agency, right? But you got to do one of those two. So either give it to them or send us the information so we can rule whether or not they deserve this information. But he didn't respond to the Attorney General's office. So the Attorney General's office contacted the local DA and said, "Hey, listen, this guy, he won't even respond to us." So the DA had no choice but to launch an investigation and ended up charging this guy on 3 different counts. And then his argument was, "Oh, well, I just didn't know what to do." Well, the Attorney General said, "Send us information." So that's spelled out for you. But,
What could he face? What punishment could he face?
well, the first 2, failure to turn over the documents, was a Class A misdemeanors. Now, it went, because he's a public servant, it goes through district court. It's a grand jury has to do it. So he's going to be tried in district court. And the other, official oppression, is a 3rd-degree felony. So that's 10 years. But will he be punished? These guys he's probably going to walk. And everybody who calls me in my office and asks me about this, because everybody wants to know, I always tell them, listen, probably probation. I can't see jail time. He might get fined. Well, to get himself out of hot water, he wrote a check on the city checking account to pay for his, right, to pay attorney fees. And so that got him in trouble. And so,
What?
yeah. But meanwhile, the daffodils are beautiful. I've got to eventually get that photo in the paper, right?
What about cost? Have you guys seen? Is it reasonable? Is it outrageous? Have you felt burned? We published a story this week about we were trying to get City of Dallas had a lead program. They draw down federal dollars for this lead to take lead out of old houses. They drew down the money. They wasted it. Meaning they just didn't spend it. They didn't do it. They returned it back. We've tried to get the records, and it was like $6,000 for some small thing, and we just put that in the story. Like this, we didn't want to have records because they wanted this outrageous amount of money for not much. Are you running into that?
I think for me, an agency is either going to charge you or they won't, in my experience, usually, unless it's something very low hanging that should be relatively easy. But I find some agencies just routinely will write you the breakdown. Here's the hundreds of dollars it's going to cost. And other ones will take it upon themselves to do a public service and send us the records without a check. So,
Yeah, that was going to be my answer too. I think it depends on the agency that you're asking for the information and how much they want you to have it or not.
Yeah, I think those are aligned. Like it's this much money, and we really weren't going to give it to you in the first place.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay. How about some questions from the room?
I was going to ask Scott, but he answered it already. So my question, Tony, about your case is that that's ongoing. As far as the information that you said, no one else had been given that kind of security. So that's part one for it. Misappropriation of funds because the taxpayers are paying for something for 7 months. Obviously, the threat's not there. 7 months, they're waiting a long time to do whatever they're going to do. And then if it is a crime of misappropriation of taxpayers' funds, are we going to be giving that information? And is it our responsibility as journalists to give that information to the authorities? And would you take that information, inform them you're also giving that to like the federal authorities?
Yeah, so is the core, it sounds like at the core of the question is the degree to which a journalist should be proactive about filing a complaint, going to the authorities about
Divulging what you find
divulging
out.
what you find out. That is generally not our practice. Our practice is to provide the information to the public and let whoever is, whatever news consumer, whatever law enforcement agency wants to examine that and take that up, that is their role. I generally feel like our lane ends once we do our reporting and provide the information to the public.
The question was, how do the journalists maintain their mental health as they're playing this game of whack-a-mole, trying to get public records and cover the ground they need to cover?
I would run to my publisher's office and say, "Oh my God, look at this." And then we would both look at it and just go, "Oh." And then I would run back to my office, start typing. And then about an hour later, "Look at this." And he would look at it and he'd go, "Oh." And then I'd run back and type. So, we had a lot of laughter, just, incredulously reading this stuff. That blows off a lot of steam. Oh my gosh. That's how we handle it.
I mean, I think for me, and I'm always happy, by the way, that when I'm talking to groups, someone always asks about mental health, which I think really shows how far this profession and this industry has come in the years that I've been in it. I mean, for me, listen, prioritizing mental health is both the easiest thing to do and also the most difficult thing to do. It's easy because I know that to do this work and to continue to do this work and to have, a duration in the profession, you've got to prioritize that to be able to keep doing and engaging in the profession. So it is something that I prioritize. I have for years. I'm fortunate that I work with people and have supportive colleagues and bosses and managers who allow that and promote that and want that. But it's also difficult because there's always the next story, the next thing, the next project, the next interview. But yeah, I always keep in the front of my mind that it is a huge priority. And the decisions that we often have to make, the editorial decisions that sometimes we're confronted with. I mean, certainly the Uvalde video is an extreme example of that, but the decisions that we have to make require clarity and focus. And if we're not on top of taking care of ourselves, we're not going to have that clarity and focus when we have to make an important decision. I'm also very lucky too that I work and have worked with very strong a support network and people who encourage the work itself. And I find that is hugely important to my own mental health, that they believe in what we're doing here.
Yeah, I struggled with this a lot during our Uvalde reporting as well. I think for me, the thing that made the biggest difference is that we very rarely on my team work alone, which is very helpful to have another person going through exactly what you're going through, not only with the gravity of whatever story you may be dealing with, but obviously the hurdles you face through the editing process and reporting and all of that as well, which, can only add to it. So I think if I can encourage, collaboration among other reporters, that is, a huge help. Or if you can even just, be in constant contact, I think having someone else to lean on and working in person. I typically work remotely, but whenever I can, I did this series on the military justice system with one of my other colleagues, and it got to the point we were just going in every day. I'm like, okay, we're going to take a break for lunch. We're going to go get a cookie. We're going to split it. And then we're going to come back and reset and get back into it. So I think that has been my sort of fail-safe.
I can also add to that is my boss is it is stress relieving to know that they always got your back and they encourage, that's a good story. Stick with it. Stick with it. Man, that's leave at the end of the night, you go home and have some pizza and you don't have to worry about it because they want you to write this kind of stuff. And they really push this. They really believe in government watchdog and public service. And that takes a lot of stress off just knowing that.
The question is about these offshoot committees and around local government that you don't necessarily think to even check on in terms of accountability.
Mhm.
Who's got an answer for that?
Thanks for the tip.
Yeah, that's
Thanks for the
how I took it
reminder
as
is my
well.
answer.
Is there a way to track that at a state level that you're saying?
I had I ran into an attorney in the courthouse. I was covering a trial one day, and he came up and talked to me. Said, "Listen, you gotta go over there to the county. You gotta get some information out to the public. They're hiring interns every summer, and every intern is a child of someone who works in the county." Oh, I didn't know that. I had taken the photo of the interns, and they were all smiling, and they were all going out to work. But I mean, I didn't know whose kids they were. But this attorney, attorneys, they have their ear to the ground. They know everything. So this attorney tipped me off to it. It was amazing. And I would have never known that. They're not something they're going to say at commissioner's court meeting. By the way, this is my son. This is her daughter.
Question, Scott. Okay, on the complaint that went up to the Attorney General's office, did you guys make that complaint when it came to mayor and
Which ones?
the prosecution of the mayor?
Okay, so we had a local businessman who filed that complaint, a local businessman whose water bill jumped from $100 a month to $700 a month. It went up $600, and he wanted to know why. And the mayor said, "I don't have to tell you why." And he goes, "Well, is there an ordinance or anything?" He goes, "I don't have to give it to you." So, and so there was some back and forth on that. And the businessman came to my office with a hat in hand, said, "Can you please write something about this?" I said, "Well," it wasn't very sexy. I said, "Well, I can see what I can do, but, and so he kept coming back week after week, and I kept, stalling him because I just didn't have time with it. At the time, and finally we started looking into it, and he had hired an attorney. The attorney filed open records requests with the city. The city never responded to those, just like they didn't respond to me. And so the attorney filed a complaint with the AG's office. The AG office then sent a demand letter to the city, and the city didn't respond to it. And then it went to the DA, and then the indictments came down. But yeah, and this businessman he owned a little tiny trailer park, and that was breaking him, jumping the water up that much, and he knew it was illegal.
So, the second part here, that's a really good story, and I'm glad to know kind of how it came about. And have two quick things. Have you ever seen another prosecution come from the AG's office, like for a public information situation like that? Because they're rare. Have you seen that in your community before? And then I'll just make a pitch. Anybody else who has seen examples like this, I'm collecting them, so please let me know of this failure to respond.
So the question was, have you seen any other prosecutions from the AG office?
Right. I haven't seen other than this one. I did contact one of your FOIA attorneys on the hotline, and I got some beautiful, wondrous comments from him about this. Going, that's so rare that he hadn't himself seen or heard this in 10 years. And then he went on and on about how this was public information. They should have just immediately provided it. And that he could expect to be in big trouble because he's going to explain to a jury why he didn't respond to the Attorney General's office. So, but that's the only one I've seen. But
The question is, does any of these softwares for public records, does it work? Is it easy for us?
It doesn't. I mean, for me, it doesn't matter. I will say, like, those programs, those online portals and stuff are becoming the norm, I think, for most entities that I request information from. But whether it's an email or a portal or written on the back of a napkin, which I've done before, and like handed to a clerk, like to me, like a request is a request. And so however it gets made, I don't think I'm getting better.
I would say it's easier to like keep things organized in that sense. Like the governor's office still doesn't use one of them.
Mhm.
And so sometimes I feel like mine are just like floating in different email chains. So I think in that sense you can log on and clearly see like, and it tells you the status of each one, which is helpful. I don't mind the automated legalese response because you get that over email anyway. I would just say like, you know, what we've raised whenever we can have a conversation, that's always welcomed.
Mhm.
Helpful.
I've had no luck. Electronics, I've just had no luck. Everybody I send out to, no one gets the email. No one, I guess, don't read their portals. I don't know. I only get luck if I do it physically and mail it out and return request service requested. Usually I use that always exclusively, but I try electronically, it just doesn't work. It saves us some money, but
I want to thank our panelists.
Thank you, Amy, for moderating.